It's 3:40 and time to start again. Our next speaker is Ranae Dietzel. She is a postdoctoral research associate in the Integrated Cropping Systems Lab in the Department of Agronomy at Iowa State University. She has a master's degree in soil science and a PhD in sustainable agriculture and crop production and physiology.
Hello. Today I'll be talking about water use efficiency and talking about it in a little bit of a different way than people have traditionally used it. So first of all, what do I mean when I'm talking about efficiency? Well, traditionally people have looked at how efficient plants are with water by basically taking the yield and seeing how much yield you get for how much water the plant actually uses. So evapotranspiration shown here is a combination of evaporation of water from the soil and also transpiration, which is like how much water the plant is pumping out as it performs all the processes it needs to perform. So this definition is very physiological for the plant. You could apply it to just one corn plant, for example, and it's very yield focused. Evapotranspiration generally doesn't change that much, but yield can vary a lot. So you tend to see very low efficiency when you have low yields and very high efficiency when you have high yields. So it's one way to look at it, but if you sort of step back and you were looking at an entire field from sort of a systems level, you might start to think about where the rest of the water is going and sort of all the water dynamics there. And you might ask, how efficient is it to receive water but not use it? So having water available and then having a plant basically throw it away can also be viewed as an inefficiency. And it's an inefficiency that probably coming to this conference you already know has a lot of consequences. When we lose water from the fields, we lose soil, we lose nutrients, pesticides. All of these things go into the water where it's really harmful, and this also lost from the field, which isn't good for the field either. So here is a more comprehensive definition of water use efficiency for the entire system. Now we still have yield on the top, the grain mass, and evapotranspiration on the bottom, but we've also added runoff and drainage as basically penalties. If you have more runoff and more drainage, then you'll have lower efficiencies. If you have low yields, you'll still have lower efficiencies. So it sort of gets both ends of the spectrum here. The only problem with this definition is that everything on the denominator is extremely difficult to measure. So that is why the subtitle of the talk is a systems modeling analysis. To really use this definition and to look at what it means, we needed to use a model. And so let me take a minute to tell you a little bit about what I mean by a model. So we have a computer program that basically simulates how a cropping system works or how a field works. And we start with the soil. You put in all the important soil parameters, texture, pH, how much carbon and nitrogen is in the soil. And then you add a crop on top of that. So in this case, corn or soybean. And you put in all your management factors, time of planting, fertilization, what kind of tillage. And then you have your system basically sitting there. Everything that the computer needs to know it has, and it's just sort of waiting. So then you add weather data. And as soon as the crop and soil gets precipitation, sunlight, it knows what the temperatures are, and things start to happen in your model. And you can really see some of these interactions, and you start to get outputs, like how much biomass is produced. Also, what temperature and moisture the soil is, which affects how much biomass is produced, and then how much biomass is produced also affects the soil temperature and moisture. And we can then further go on and to look at things like evapotranspiration. So from the model we use, we can get almost everything that you can imagine happening in the field. But this is the simple part of how, let's see how it's set up. So if you want to know what's happening over a lot of different years, you can put in a lot of different weather files, and you can see what happens in each of these different years. So the model that we used for the study and used for a lot of things in our lab is called APSIM. It's from Australia, actually. It stands for the Agricultural Production System Simulator. It includes 60 different models. So it has different kinds of soils models within it that you can put with different kinds of crop models, different kinds of soil water models. There's sort of a lot of different things you can do with it. It has a very user-friendly interface, which isn't true of a lot of other models. This is basically point and click. And if you want to go into really into the model and see how it works, it's very transparent. You can see all the source code, and you can see everything the scientists wrote to make the model. It's very frequently updated. There's about 2 new versions every year, so they're constantly incorporating new findings in science and things that people have found are wrong with the model. So it's also free to everyone, so anyone in this room could go and download it right now and probably start using it. There is a lot of information online of how to use it. And once you start using it, you also become part of the community that you can start suggesting improvements to them and basically get involved with building the model from there on out. So all these models run on a daily time step at a field scale. The models that we used were maize, soybean, and winter wheat. For the crops, we used soil N for organic carbon and nitrogen cycling, surface organic matter, or surface OM for residue decomposition, SWIM for soil water, and soil temperature Q for soil temperature. So once we have this model and once it's running really well, we also need a field site to test if it's running really well and to see if the measurements actually match up with what the model is predicting. So we used a site called the Comparison of Biofuel Systems, or COBS, that was planted in 2008. So COBS is very large, and today I'll just be talking about the row crop treatments, so I won't be talking about the prairies. We have soybean corn and the complementary corn soybean. We also have continuous corn with and without a rye cover crop. And this field is super monitored. We know everything that's happening almost all the time. So we have a whole suite of soil measurements that we're taking at the beginning of the experiment and taking periodically afterwards. Particle size analysis, so knowing how much sand, silt, and clay is in there, bulk density, field capacity, wilting point, pH, nitrogen, and carbon. We also have sensors that work on every 30 minutes to measure soil moisture and soil temperature at 5 different depths, 5 centimeters, 10, 17.5, 30, and actually 50. So we have every 30 minutes for 8 years now. That's a lot of data. A very unique thing about this plot is that, or about this experiment is that every single plot has its own tile line. So in between plots we have lines that are like border tiles to separate the plots, and then going through the middle of the plot there is a tile that captures most of what drains through the soil. And then it goes onto the edge and into these sumps where the flow is monitored, so we know how much water is going through the soil, and then they also take a sample to see how much nitrate and dissolved organic carbon are in those samples. And a whole suite of plant measurements too, just constantly tracking growth and looking at differences between yields. Greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And there's also a weather station out there, which is very important for our model. We have good data for temperature, precipitation, and radiation. So this, a lot of models don't have so much data to test against, which could make it kind of challenging if a model is doing well on one component and not well on the other. You have to change sort of everything until you have a systems balance that it's running well. And fortunately, we ended up with something that was running very well. I'll show you some of the results that are relevant to a water balance. First, this is biomass. The lines here are the simulated data, and the red points are what was actually measured. On the top is continuous corn, then the continuous corn with the rye. You can see the little peaks for rye down there, then the corn soybean and the soybean corn. And for the most part, the biomass sort of matched up with what was measured and what the model predicted. Here are what some of the data from those sensors look like. Here at 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters, still pretty good. 15 centimeters, 35, and 50. So we were really happy with how the model was performing with the soil water, which indicated things like the plants were taking up as much water as the model thought it was taking up. And as much water was reaching down to these layers as the model thought it was. So we began to feel very confident about the water balance and that we would be able to determine things like evapotranspiration, runoff and drainage, which as I said are very hard to measure. And for further confidence, we could compare how much tidal drainage we had. So the black lines are observed measurements, and the gray is simulated with the model. And in every year, we were very close with what was predicted, what was measured, except for 2010 and the soybean, for some reason, didn't do a very good job. So you might have noticed already from that tidal drainage graph, over these 6 years, we had a lot of weather variability. We had flooding, we had drought, and we had years that were just historically average. So the red line in these figures is the historical average of the last 30 years, where we would expect precipitation to be, and then the black line is what actually happened that year. And in 2008, 2010, and 2012, so the even years, they were really off the average. The first two, 2008 and 2010, were very wet years, and 2012 was a very dry year, whereas the odd years, 2009, 2011, and 2013 were more similar to what we had historically seen. And this came through in the efficiencies. So here on the left, we have the traditional water use efficiency, and you can tell that the lowest efficiency we had, this is grouping all the corn treatments together, the lowest efficiency we had was for 2012, the very dry year, because it was dry and we didn't have great yields. Whereas in the wet years like 2008 and 2010, traditionally it would have been very efficient because nobody cared that we had so much water that just left the system. With the system's water use efficiency definition, you can see that 2008 and 2010 were more penalized and had lower efficiencies because they had all this water loss. I guess I would also mention the difference in corn and soybean is sort of because we have different crops, that the corn is C4 and the soybean is C3. So we didn't expect the soybean to be as efficient as the corn. So it was just, it was nice that we had all this weather variability, and we were able to see flood, drought, in historic years, and start to think about what this might actually mean, but we still only had 6 years, and it's not a lot of data, so we went back to the model, and we decided to put a lot more weather years until we ended up with 96 years. So here, the blue dots are the years that we actually measured. The rest of the dots are years that the model produced through putting in the past 30 years of weather data. And then we played with that data a little bit. We increased each rainfall event by 15%, and we decreased each rainfall event by 15%. So we started to see a pattern after we did this. And basically what you see here is sort of looking for that sweet spot where we are neither going to be having reductions in yield, and we also won't be having any great losses of water. And that ended up being about 430 millimeters, or about 17 inches of rain, would put us at a spot where we aren't going to either way of that dotted line, which the left side of the dotted line, low yield because it's too dry, and the right side, low efficiencies because we're losing water from the system. So we also do this for soybean. And the soybean was losing more water more often, so it had a lower optimum rainfall around 317 millimeters, or about 12 inches during the growing season. So, actually, I kind of like to look at the corn one when I say this. So here in the Midwest, the climate predictions are such that we think we will be having more drought and more flooding. So for systems water use efficiency, this means that we're going to be having a lot more years that are far to the left of the dotted line and far to the right of the dotted line, and we're going to have fewer years that are right there in that sweet spot. So overall, we can just expect more years with really low system water use efficiency. Yield will be inhibited in dry years, and water will pass through the system in wet years. So if we think of this problem of having wet and dry, there's not going to be one single plant that we can engineer that will work really well in wet conditions and dry conditions. So we're going to need sort of a combination of plants that work, some that work well in wet and some that work well in dry. So we need to start thinking of cropping systems more in these terms of diversity and making modifications that will include both drought-tolerant plants and flood-tolerant plants. So instead of trying to think about how we could maybe just increase yield of one single plant, we should sort of step back and think of a system-level solution. And I'm just going to throw out like two nice pictures of examples of these. If you were here for the presentation before me, there was a whole list of things that farmers can do. But I'll just list two because otherwise this talk would end on a really depressing note, I think. So here's this TRIPS project, which is an incorporation of perennial prairie into row crop fields, and this plan takes about 10% of the field out of production, but decreases nitrate loss by about 90%. So it seems so far to be very effective, and in the last 2 years, there's been a lot more field implementation of this plan, even though it's still in sort of an experimental phase. But this is a picture of a planting from last year. And then another thing that we do see on the landscape that isn't a new idea is hay and pasture. You are able to design seed mixes that have drought-tolerant plants and flood-tolerant plants, and depending on the weather, you'll have more dominant species from one of these, but you have more resilience so that if one kind of species is failing, then the other will pick it up. And you don't have to drive far from Ames to see hay fields or to see cows grazing, but it's something that we definitely have less of than we used to. So I will leave up this funding and this thanks, and I can take questions at this time.
On that field that you got all those tests on, is that all the same soil type, the whole field, or is there a difference in soil type on one side to the other?
There's two very similar soil types, Nicolet and Webster. But it was specially selected to have much soil types, so we wouldn't have as many complications in the experiment.
So how can you be sure it's going to work on my soil type and change the primitives of the soil?
Right, your soil type would have a different optimum rainfall for the growing season. But with just a few parameters, like if we had the soil type, we could quickly come up with an estimate of what that would be. Which is something, a whole other project, but we're working on getting into more and more soil types. For a lot of the soil types in Iowa right now, we have them basically in a file where we can just pull them out in the model. So we don't have to go look for the parameters. This project is focused on this one site we have, but we'd definitely like to expand.
So does it make a difference on the cropping history? Like, been no-tilling for a long time, does that make a difference?
Yep.
When I got cover crops in the farm, that changes that too?
It definitely will.
That's in the model?
It could be.
Could be.
I mean, we'd have to just type it. Just type it in there and say, no-till history. And then we'd have to test it.
So you do it for different seed varieties, or is that just one seed variety?
This one was one seed variety, but we have 26 available. Hybrids for corn and about, I think, 24 for soybean.
What was the significance of those biomass graphs you were showing? I kind of missed that because it kind of, I don't know, it just went over my head.
No, that's okay. It shows that the model is basically doing a good job of capturing all the processes of what we need for crop growth. So if some of the water was off, like if we didn't have enough soil water, then we wouldn't have as much growth as we need in reality. So it's basically a test of if the water is working, if the model is working, and if we could trust the water balance.
You let the climate kind of justify the amount of rain and moisture that the plots got. Was there any talk about creating a irrigation system so that you could find more of a base and not let the climate dictate your results?
Yes. Actually, originally when we were looking at how different water regimes would affect the efficiency, we were using irrigation instead of adjusting the precipitation. But since the area, especially that this study is in, doesn't have much irrigation, we sort of just went the other way and adjusted the precipitation. But it could have been done either way, and you'd see similar results. The thing with irrigation, you can also, sort of write rules so that when in the model, when the soil water gets to this very low point or, a set point, then the irrigation will kick in. And that did sort of help make the systems more efficient, only receiving water when the system really needed it.
Does the optimum rainfall level change and be spread out as you incorporate some of those conservation practices like no-till or cover crop, or does it stay within that same range?
I haven't checked directly. We did have one cover crop and one non-cover crop treatment. The non-continuous corn, which people don't really do, and there was not a real difference there. Yeah, it's sort of a weird treatment because it's also, since it's a biofuel study, we take all the residue off, or we take 50% of the residue off, and then also have the cover crop. So it sort of balances out.
Given that it has like a daily time step, do people use this to manage the crop when they're irrigating?
Not right now, but we're working on trying to get it implemented to not manage only irrigation, but things like nitrogen additions or spraying for fungicide, because it can tell you phenology when your crop is going to hit a certain growth stage when you might want to spray. It'll tell you what your nitrogen levels are. So we're actually trying to incorporate this model right now with the 2-week weather forecast, and then make sort of an in-field forecast of like, this is what's just going to happen in your field this week, to try and help people with management.
Did you do any research on like alternative methods of watering in the early phases when you still were using irrigation? Like, what was the irrigation model set up to mimic?
I think we just put in three different times of irrigation when we just sort of by eyeballing it thought like, this is a dry period, let's try and irrigate here. I don't know, we weren't real serious with it, we were just sort of testing out what would happen and sort of how this system's water use efficiency would respond to different management. Yeah, so definitely something we could go back and look at more if we thought there was more interest in irrigation in Iowa. Or if this model was also moved out of the state, which could happen too.
Renee, if you go back to your figure that has the water use efficiencies bar chart there, where did the air bars come from on the corn? Why is there not even air bars on the soybean?
Since we had 3 corn treatments, the corn soybean, the continuous corn, and the continuous corn with rye, the corn treatments were grouped together, but we only had 1 soybean treatment. So there's no air bars on the soybean.
Is this from actual measurements or this is model results?
This is a combination of, well, yeah, these are model results, but we modeled all 4 treatments.
Can you go one slide forward? What is typical ET for a corn crop over the growing season?
It is about 430 millimeters.
Is it that?
Like-
I thought, my impression is it's more than that.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I don't know, that's why I'm asking.
Actually, I thought 430 was around maximum ET.
The reason why I ask that is I'm thinking about what we have there is total growing season rainfall, but my understanding, which may not be correct, is that we can't grow crops just on what we get during the growing season, that what we get outside of the growing season is very important also.
Right.
So I'd be surprised if that optimum 430 was equal to ET. That would assume that we could start out with a perfectly dry soil and end up with a perfectly dry soil and still produce a crop, which I don't think would happen. So my question gets to this variability that's happening. How much of that variability do you think is from out of season precipitation, and how important would that be, and what roles it play in the water use efficiency of these crops?
Right, that's a really good question. There was different water storage at the beginning of all of these years, since we had data sets that, precipitation was happening before the growing season. So to try and account for that variability, we have so many years, so that we didn't, sort of like an indirect way of accounting for it. When we started outside of the growing season, when we started with January 1st and didn't have any water in the soil, it didn't work. There didn't seem to be any relationship. But when we looked at it within the growing season, we saw this pattern.
Another question. Over the 30 years, yields have increased considerably over that time. I assume they've increased, 50 bushels per acre over 30 years, is that right? In Iowa? Or more than that? Does that change your curve any? When you look back? And you have,
So this is all,
this was averaging, right?
so the hybrid here never changed. We use the same hybrid and modern hybrid with modern management practices. So we kept all the management practices and the corn the same. The only thing that changed here is the weather.
So what do you think happened actually? What would the curve have been back in 1980? Been the same curve as today?
My understanding would be that in 1980 we would have needed maybe more water, that we have less efficient systems. So I do think the curve would be different. I think this curve can change under a lot of different circumstances. And the shape of the curve might stay the same, but the optimum is always going to be changing as we change management or as you change factors in your field. So this is an average hybrid and average management, central Iowa, sort of as average as we could have gotten, to give an example.
I was just wondering, if climate changes and yields change, and will the curve move to the right? Or will it move to the left? Or will it stay the same?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on if it's a dry year, or if we are starting to get more dry years or more wet years. Well, no, actually, it shouldn't change. They should fit on the curve. The future years should fit on the curve.
Well, is it still based on efficiency, even if your yield is changing?
Right.
Your model still works.
Right.
What do you guys take away?
Probably, just that corn and soybean systems aren't going to continue doing as well as they have been doing if climate predictions are right. So if people want to remain profitable and or more environmentally friendly, then there needs to be some changes made within the systems or switch to different systems.
All right, we need to stop so people can get the next one. Thank Ranae.
As much as we can. It just But you probably have less, you probably have half the one. Because our requirements.
The rough ET number I have in my head is 700.
But that's, that handout, interesting. Was it easy to use that bottle?
It is easy. I mean, relatively easy.
You know, one thing that we had, if we look at irrigation efficiency, that's just pounds of.
Yeah, the first week, so I knew that,
It's
she'd
1.2%
been in.
a year on irrigation. The bushels
So like
raised
irrigation
for
club, and you know
problem
that,
water, irrigation water.
having their own.
Because yields are higher. And I got the thing, we're
Like
going
like
to
the graders and that kind of thing.
and our nitrogen efficiency, we put on the same nitrogen rates.
The first week, we had the annual
Yeah,
H1 day, and
fertilizer.
then we had.
It's our nitrogen fertilizer
Upper
efficiency.
side, so she didn't have, that giving shots really good with education.